we are finally going to get to policy-based governance, what it is and how it can be a tool that enables you to answer these questions effectively. But before we do, because you can tell that we are fully committed to this model and that we think it works really well. We really don't want to force it down your throats, however. So I want to take time to do an exercise to help you assess, is this model going to support what I and my congregation value about governance? Is it going to allow me to take forward the qualities of governance I want to bring forward into the future in our congregation? So to get at this, to uncover what you value about governance, I want to do an exercise, a reflective exercise, a slightly meditative exercise that takes you back to a time when your congregation was particularly effective, a time when your congregation made a difference to you or to someone else that you found particularly meaningful. And I know when I do this exercise for myself, the time that I immediately go back to is when my congregation completely revamped religious education. We took it from a place that was difficult for me to drag my children kicking and screaming to services every Sunday, to a place that was I loved teaching in, kids enjoyed participating in. We got, I don't know how, we had lots of phenomenal growth, I think, within the religious education community. It was that transformation of religious education that was really meaningful to me. So I want you to think back to a time like that in your own congregational life. And if it helps you to reflect on that time, close your eyes while I ask you a few questions about that time. So when was this time that your congregation was particularly effective? What's the situation? Think back to it. And think back, how are people taking part in making this difference that matters? Now think about the governance of your congregation at that time. Think broadly about the systems that decided what difference was going to be made, and then the systems that actually made that difference real. What did you value about governance, your congregation's governance in this situation? Now, because this is an important conversation to have with your congregation as you figure out how are we going to structure our governance, I want to give you a chance to see how this exercise might work in your congregation, how you might have this conversation. So I'm going to return to the exercise that we did after the experience of the Holy. What I'd like you to do is get together with a partner, share what you valued about governance, and again, make a list. What 3 qualities would you both agree you would want to bring forward into the future of your congregation's governance? And then we'll have groups of 4 do the same thing again. Make a list of 3 items that you can all agree you value about governance together that you'd want to bring forward into the future. We'll see, again, if there's some kind of consensus emerging about the qualities of governance, what you value about governance together.
Okay, let's assume you've decided that policy governance would work for you. What do you have to do to become a policy governance organization? And it's just a structure.
What we've tried to do is make it a lot more approachable and a lot more systematic. What I hope people take away from the track is a more systematic approach to doing this work, so it doesn't feel so overwhelming and it doesn't feel impossible, because it really is work that all congregations should be doing in order to be more who they really want to be in the world.
I'm going to be talking about 9 principles that we as members of Unity Consulting have adapted from the Carver model. The first principle is that the board governs on behalf of the moral ownership of the congregation that is not seated at the table. And John Carver has a wonderful quote, I think, about this. The primary relationship the board must establish, maintain, clarify, and protect is its relationship with its moral ownership, keeping in contact with them and hearing their voices. The second policy-based governance principle that I want to introduce is that boards speak with one voice or not at all. Speaking with one voice means that the board has brought these diverse voices together, not only the people in the room, the boardroom, but all the people that those people in the boardroom have linked with, who have given them ideas and feedback and information that they're trying to absorb and figure out how does this fit into the future of our church. Without this principle of speaking with one voice, the board's voice loses its substance and its authority to speak. And the board needs to speak with one voice because of the next principle, that the board primarily governs through written policy. The board governs the congregation primarily through the policies that they write, but these policies are far from being mere orders or rules. Policies are statements of the board's values and the board's vision for the future. The policies are meant to be meant, and they are living documents that guide all operational plans. I want to draw your attention to the fact that these policies only mention the executive and not other staff or committees or any other group, and that relates directly to the next principle, that of delegation. When I heard John Carver talk, he put it this way. He said, the board has to take their vision for the future and their values for the present and pin them on somebody. Somebody has to be responsible to make sure that the board's values and vision are going to be the guiding force to take us into the future. And so rather than pin this on several people, the board delegates the responsibility for that journey on one person, or in the case of many Unitarian Universalist congregations, on a small group of people that act as and speak with one voice as an executive team. This is very important because it helps to eliminate triangulation. It prevents the board or its individual members from directing the activity of the staff and confusing them about whose direction they should take. And as a person who's worked under other models, I've had many board members call me under other models and say, here's what I think we should do. Let's do this. And when you have 9 or 12 people coming at you with different directions and different ideas, it's very hard to know what I should do. What will I be held accountable for? So it's very important that they speak with one voice to one person, and they put it in writing so that the executive knows exactly what they want and where they want us to go. The next principle also contributes to effective delegation from board to executive leader and to developing the relationship of trust and collaboration between the board and the executive leader. And this is really a very important one, as you can imagine. The principle is to distinguish ends from means, and this takes practice. We introduced the concept of ends earlier when we talked about the nested bowls, and you'll remember that we talked about how ends issues are about results, not what activities we will do, but what difference we will make. An issue that describes one or more of these attributes is an ends issue. What difference do we want to make, for which people, at what cost or priority? Ask yourself that question. Does it answer these questions? Then you probably know you've got an end on your hands. Everything else is means. Answering these 3 questions is really the primary work of the board. Distinguishing between ends and means helps the board fulfill its role as visionary leadership of a congregation. And here's another quote from Carver that I think illustrates this very well. The justification for any body lies in what difference it can make. A nonprofit organization exists so that its world can be a better place. The kind of thinking needed in order to make a difference requires a sense of the whole, an overview, a high vantage point. The board will become more of a think tank for vision than a reviewer of staff decisions and activities. It will focus on outcomes, focus on the reasons for which the organization exists at all. The only way that a board becomes involved in operational means is summarized in the next principle. The board controls means through executive limitations. In other words, the board delegates the accomplishments of its ends policies to its executive and stays out of the means except to say what the executive cannot do in the board's name. This is an example of an executive limitation from Unity Church's policies. With respect to the actual ongoing condition of the organization's financial health, the executive team may not cause or allow the development of fiscal jeopardy or loss of allocation integrity. Accordingly, the executive team may not, 1, expend more funds that have been received in the fiscal year to date unless the debt guideline below is met. A, indebt the organization in an amount greater than can be repaid by certain otherwise unencumbered funds within 90 days. B, allow cash to drop below the amount needed to settle payroll and debts in a timely manner. Now, there are additional requirements and restraints within this policy, but it gives you an idea of how the language works, and it gives you an idea that it's actually common sense. So executive limitations are one important principle that make delegation to the executive leader work. The other important principle that makes delegation work is to develop policies as nested sets. And I'll show you an example from an executive limitation that was written by the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta. The executive limitations start with a general or global limitation. The executive shall not cause or allow any practice, activity, decision, or congregational circumstance that is inconsistent with our Unitarian Universalist principles or is unlawful, imprudent, or in violation of professional ethics or commonly accepted business practices. The next principle also supports effective delegation to the executive leader. Boards need to monitor executive performance effectively. Good monitoring is extremely important so that the board can relax about the present and get on with the future. Good monitoring gives boards confidence that their ends are being achieved without violating their executive limitations. But what does good monitoring look like? It includes 3 important qualities that the board needs to evaluate. 1, they need to evaluate executive performance against the executive leader's approved interpretation of the board's policy words. So it's not okay to evaluate performance the board hasn't asked for. Second, on how effectively the executive accomplishes the ends without violating the executive limitations. And they need to use data. The last point about using data for measurement is key. In policy-based governance, the board asks the executive leader to interpret their policies to identify what data will show that the executive leader has indeed produced the difference for the people the board identified in the ends. The executive leader also identifies what data will show that they have stayed within the executive limitations. Our final principle of policy-based governance is one that holds the whole model together, and that is that boards must commit to disciplining themselves. They commit to be responsible for their own work. This means it's not fair to ask the executive leader to create the board agenda, write the minutes of the board, or do research for the board. The board is responsible for doing this work for itself. Following these principles is following the policy-based governance model.
Governance liberates leadership. Leadership does not have to be lonely. It can be a conversation in which we encourage one another. Good governance convenes that conversation and strengthens our communities.